So I ended up starting to struggle through fear and idolatry as strongholds. And the crazy part was that I didn't even realize that those were becoming strongholds in my life. So growing up in my household, my father's amazing, and I always saw him be so generous towards other people, but he had a relationship that was really oscillating with his finances. So while he was generous with others on the outside, at home he would always be worried about money. It would always be talking about scarcity or kind of in a scarcity mindset, and it just sounded like, there was like a limited supply of this resource that we had. That relationship that my father had with his finances going back and forth, it developed into this ideology that I had to kind of be self-sufficient, or I was the one that was going to be reliant to make ends meet, and it kind of felt like the source of money was not to be trusted, whatever it was, and that it was almost like a faucet that could be turned off at any moment. Whatever money was talked about or preached at church, I thought, well, it's just a practical need, and they seem to be keeping the lights on. I show up every week, the building's still here, the staff is still here, so I didn't really see how my contribution could make a difference to what was already happening. And I definitely didn't see the correlation between finances and money and giving and what that could do in my own relationship with God. At the time, I had been working in corporate, I was going to church, and I said my identity was in Christ. I said that I believed that God was a source of my provider, but in reality, I wasn't even giving to the church. So everything changed for me when I decided to quit my corporate job, and everything sort of fell flat from underneath me. That I realized then the truth that my identity hadn't been in Christ, even though I thought that it was. It was really in my job title, the company that I worked for, the salary, the connections, and I felt super lost, really anxious at the time after I decided to quit for months. And I would wake up in the middle of the night in sweats and panic, not really knowing, where my life was going, where my next source of finances were going to come from. As I was going through those months right after quitting my job, a moment that really changed things for me was when I ended up going to a Christian conference out in LA, and I was hearing about it. I felt called to go, but practically it didn't make sense to me. I'm thinking, why would I fly across the country and spend money when I'm trying to save what's in my savings account? I don't have a source of income. Why would I do that? But in the end, faith kind of took over, and I decided to just give it a shot and go. And when I went over there, I ran into a woman who I had served with maybe 2 or 3 times. She was a relative stranger to me, but I told her my story and how I ended up there, and she wanted to take me to lunch the next day. So the next day we went out to lunch, and while we were there, she handed me an envelope that I did not open until I got back to my hotel room, but it was actually a check for $1,500. And this woman was a single mother, like she was making ends meet on her own, but somehow God had spoke to her to give this to me, and it provided for my flight, my hotel room, all the expenses for my trip, and then some. And I just couldn't believe. I was really in shock that God would use someone who was so humble in that way to bless me financially. It just made me realize that God knows every single penny, and He doesn't only have one avenue that He wants to bless us through. He wants us to be receptive in what He has to offer and how He wants to provide for us. And more recently, as another example, I was working with a client, and she overpaid me by $62.50, like very specific amount. She would never have noticed that she did this. But I thought, okay, well, I didn't actually earn this, so I need to give it back to her. So I Venmo'd it back to her. And then 4 hours later, that same day, a completely different client fulfilled an invoice for me for $625. And I just felt like it was God's way of saying, I see you, I see this honesty, and like whatever I thought that I was losing by surrendering, He was already planning to multiply. So I learned so much about God's character in that time. I realized now, and just my whole approach to giving has been different. So I realized that we are part of His kingdom, and that God doesn't steal or take from His kingdom. He only multiplies and increases His kingdom. And so I just saw how faithful He is, how He truly is a source of provision if we would only look to Him and focus on Him. So when fear and idolatry try to creep back in, I just stop and take a look at God's track record with me, how He provided for me through that time. He provided for me financially, but He also built me up spiritually and really matured me to trust Him in a way that I don't think in a scarcity mindset anymore. I don't think that the faucet's gonna turn off at any moment, but I'm only seeing what he's gonna do in abundance to it, and knowing that whatever I put into it, whatever I, kind of receive from him, he's gonna continue to multiply and increase. Before this generosity journey, I would say I was just defined by anxiousness, especially right after I left that job and I realized that there was no provision. It was just anxiety all the time for months. Now, after I've gone through this journey and I see what God has done and I know now who he is firmly, I can say I'm receptive. So receptive is how I would define how I look at it now, and just being open to receive from him. God is faithful. It's easy to say, it's hard to walk through it, but he does provide.